Saluda a los
Hello to everybody. Welcome to our webinar called Latin America and its Economy. From unexcitement to cautious optimism. The economic situation of Latin America has been marked in the last decade for great challenges. The region has been facing a great slowdown in its growth, high levels of imbalance, and important geographical distortion. And the book of Latin America and its Economy, From Desilusion to Cautious Optimism, written by Claudio Loza, sets a very thorough analysis of these challenges, but also the opportunities that could create a more stable and promising economic future of our region. The goal that we have with this webinar is to present and discuss the main findings of Claudio's book, reflecting upon the economic evolution of the region, the obstacles that we are facing in the present, and the forecasts for a more optimistic future. We will have his vision in around 30 minutes, and then we'll have the remarks by Alejandro Werner about the book and its proposals. And after these interventions, will have a final Q&A session for some questions that have been picked throughout the registration process that you've been developing as attendees to this webinar. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Claudio so that he can start his presentation. For the audience, Claudio is very well known, so I'm going to make a very brief introduction, and this will never be enough. So Claudio has been working for IMF for more than 3 decades with different positions, including the director of the Southern Hemisphere. And throughout his management, he led different negotiations with different countries of the region, among which we have the biggest ones. And Claudio has a degree at the Cuyo University. He has a PhD at the University of Chicago. And he has combined his institutional experience with an active participation in the academy as a professor of George Washington and Foreign Service Institute universities in the Department of State of the United States. And now he heads the Centennial Group for Latin America Senior Fellow in the in Latin American dialogue. So sorry, Claudio, you have a very long CV, and I tried to pick the relevant points for our audience. But we are very grateful to have you with us, and thanks for accepting our invitation. And the floor is all yours. Great. So before getting started, before being annoying with the PowerPoint presentation, I would like to say first and foremost that I'll have to apologize because of my Argentinian accent from the city of Mendoza. We don't feel that in English, of course, but what I would like to say too is thank you to FLA, and especially Mr. President, Mr. Jose Uribe, and Mr. Carlos Giraldo that are here with us. He is the chief of economic research, for the generosity that they've had in allowing me to present this book in Spanish and to perform this presentation. So I'm really moved. I'm really moved for this situation. I'm going to speak about Latin America. Latin America, to make the long story short, where do we come from? Where are we? Why are we here? And where are we going towards? This is what I would say. And in some way, for those of you that have gray hair right now, how on earth this region that was the region with the most promising emerging countries is not that promising region anymore. The presentation is going to be very brief. The book has many aspects that are very interesting, but I think that in some way it tries to reflect not only macro economy, that is what I usually speak about because I've spent many years in the IMF, but also many structural aspects. There have been many people that have helped me. Well, besides the support by Flower of Core, and people that have worked with me, like Jose Fajerhar, Harpolan and Hari, their colleague, that are colleagues of mine, and people like Nicole Littman and Nicolite that have done a great job. But there are very important influences, of course, from Mr. Camdessu, that was the director of IMF for many years, Enrique Iglesias, the great Latin American leader, and Enrique Garcia. People that not necessarily got in, well, started to work in the book, but they played a role in what was being presented. Now I'm going to move to this presentation. I hope that this works. Let's see. So here we are. Great. Yeah, it works. Can you see the presentation, right? Okay, great. So we're going to get started very straightforward with the graphs. We'll see many graphs here. So let's see. First of all, let's move to the first graph. This is a graph, and this is a graph that shows in a summarized way the way how Latin America has evolved since the beginning of the 20th century. We had the smallest difference in terms of income with developed countries, but after the 50s, Latin America started to drop. And after the important debt crisis, and especially in terms of wrong economic policies, its ratio with the per capita GDP dropped a lot. Same happened with the Middle East countries, and we can see an important increase in the Asian countries, not only China, but also countries like India and Asian Southeast. So having said this, we would say that our Latin American optimism has been kept, and in a sustained way, Latin American people and even the Latin American bodies, as well as the fund, have been making quite positive projections, or too positive, regarding the regarding how Latin America has been developing. If we can see the graph on the left, we see a blue line to see how we expected the GDP to, well, the expectations about its growth between 2017 and 2023. In 2023, the dotted line said, well, Latin America is going to grow, but the COVID crisis hit, and the growth was much lower. Not only in Latin America, of course, but also in other countries. We don't have it here, but the countries that have recovered the best, according to what it was expected 6 years ago, are the developed countries. On the right, where you can see the blue line, well, this blue line shows that Latin America recovered if we take 2019 as a reference, but it has recovered much less than the other regions, with the exceptions of the sub-Saharan Africa, that is going through quite important issues. So we really are lagging behind, and the expectations and forecasts are quite mediocre regarding what it could happen. This is something that is not in the book strictly, but it was published last week, and this is the forecast by the World Economic Outlook for 2026 out of the monetary of the IMF that shows a drop in growth. Among the developed countries, this is not something that is very frequently seen. The US, for example, is a country that it is forecasted to drop the most. In Latin America, there is forecasted to grow by 2.5% in 2025. This has been reviewed downwards because of different conditions. Latin America, besides well, apart from the advanced economies, is a region that is expected to grow the least, and certainly much more in per capita terms. So we have some quite serious issues, I would say, in front of us. So this slow growth situation doesn't come from nowadays. It comes from many years ago. Here we can see a graph that shows for different periods the increase of the per capita revenues of Latin America and the Caribbean in green. In gray, we have the emerging markets, and in red, in orange, I would say, we have the advanced economies. On the first half of the last century, Latin America was growing much more than any of these. But after 1950, well, we have the economic recovery of Europe after the World War II. So it grew a lot, but Latin America started to lag behind partially because of protectionist policies and many macroeconomic imbalances. So the worst relative development that is said by many of us is 1980, between 1980 and 2000. This was the debt crisis that created many issues, and Latin America started to recover between 2000 and 2010. With that improvement in terms of exchange, the situation improved, but we were lagging behind in terms of growth compared to China or India. And after year, well, from 2010 to 2024, we had lower exchange rates, and Latin America was lagging behind again. This is quite a dramatic situation, by the way. But what is interesting here is that this is dominated by the big countries of the region. So 60% of Latin America's GDP is explained by Brazil and Mexico. Depending on the exchange rate, circumstances, etc., Mexico sometimes gets closer to Brazil, although it is a smaller country with less population than Brazil. But if we include Argentina, Colombia, Chile, and Peru, we would have 90% of the GDP. Sorry, 85 and 90% if we add Ecuador, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Venezuela, many of the FLA members. But this means that, well, Latin America on a global scale is very much affected by these. I've preferred to use arithmetical averages in terms of weighted averages for some indicators, because there are some countries that are relatively small, or yeah, relatively small, I would say, including Colombia, Chile, and Peru that are not small, and well, including Dominican Republic, Panama, and Ecuador, maybe not that much, that have been managing things in a very good way. And now I would like to speak a little bit, and sorry that I'm speaking very fast about all this. I would like to speak about how Latin America is perceived from an institutional point of view and other elements that, to me, explain why we've grown. We haven't grown that much, and why we are lagging behind. This is an indicator that was not produced in the World Bank anymore a few years ago, but they are starting to use it again. And there we can see Latin America in dark red, or like that, light brown. And what it shows is that we are quite worse than the ODCE countries. Here we have the different indicators. The ones that are interested in this, they can see the global indicators. The business indicator is at the top, and it proves that Latin America is lagging behind Europe, Central Asia, and Asia Pacific. It's not behind the Middle East or North Africa and African countries in general. But in many things, we have had quite a poor performance in many aspects, including, for example, protection in companies, contracts with the government, and so on and so forth. Another indicator would be the governability indicator that I've compared with the countries that have high income from the OECD countries, and non-OECD countries with high income. Latin American countries, average to high income, average to low income, and low income. Latin America is beyond the average of the medium to high income countries that are the vast majority of the region, but it's quite lagging behind in terms of governability. It has important issues in terms of public stability and the effectiveness of the government, in terms of regulatory quality, and many other aspects. So we have fails here, and this is not a weighted average, but it's a simple average. Despite all these things, Latin America, in terms of the so-called Human Development Index, has quite a good level, but it's quite stuck. It's in stagnation, so to speak. So this Human Development Index that has been prepared by United Nations is an index that includes the per capita income. It includes two education indicators, the number of people that have a title from primary and secondary education, life expectancy, and in the case of Latin America, that's quite below compared to OECD, but it's at a high level, or a little bit behind the Eastern Europe, or Europe that used to be part of the Soviet Union, plus the Eastern European countries. And we are being caught by China and Eastern Asia, unfortunately. I had to say that Japan and Korea are among the developed countries. So We're good, but we're not doing things well. And sorry for that expression. So, what other symptoms, what other problems do we have in the region? Here we have savings and investment in Latin America. In Latin America, we have the investment and savings average that are the lowest ones in the regions. There are countries that could be a little bit better, but we really don't invest much. And this explains, up to a very wide extent, that the growth is not very high. On the right, we can see the factors total productivity in red, and we are stagnated there with low investments. With low investments, sorry, we've had low innovations included in these investments, and this is why we haven't grown very much. Relatively low investment sets that we still have the active population growth, but we are turning old. And in that sense, this is what makes a region lose its positions. So the interesting thing here is that big countries, let's put it this way, plus Venezuela, big countries that are Brazil and Mexico, and as Argentinian, I would have to add as a smaller brother, I would have to include Argentina in terms of per capita income. These are countries that are growing very little. In red, we can see countries that include almost every country in the flower, and they are having important growths. So, for example, the Guyana is growing a lot, but this has to do with special conditions that have to do with oil. Same happens with Panama. But the flower countries are uh, characterized for having relatively high growths in the region. So, I think that that's quite a thing. And this graph shows the per capita income in terms of purchasing parity. And here we can see the countries, well, besides from Guyana, that has a special situation because, well, many incomes are transferred there, Panama, etc., Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica. These are countries that have high per capita income that have been correctly measured. But I won't tire you with all this. I think that I'm speaking too much, and I'll go straightforward to speak about the problems that we have and the ones that we don't have when managing economy. This graph is quite interesting because it shows how Latin America was terrible in terms of inflation. It had a very high inflation during the 80s and the 90s. This was the problem in the sense that it was not an inflation that was happening in every country, but it happened in countries and specific moments like Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Chile at its time. And during the 90s, this went down. And historically, it had gone down a lot. But of course, the graph at the top shows the inflation in the last years. Now I'll move to the next graph that explains things better. We can see the difference in terms of inflation. It shows the inflation in the last years with Argentina until 2024, and without Argentina, and basically Latin America without Argentina and Venezuela. We can see that in that case, the inflation is quite similar to international inflation rates. So I think that it is very important. I'm going to move to the next slide. And the truth is that Latin America fought against inflation. They did quite a good job. but the tax part was a little bit unattended. And this entailed that after spending everything we had in exchange terms, Latin America won a lot or gained a lot in price terms until 2012. And we were able to have quite a healthy tax situation, but we started to spend it. And the debt level compared to product increased very quickly. The public debt that in 2014 was a little bit more than 50% reached almost 70%. But after then, it has quite stabilized. Of course, the debt in advanced countries is much higher, but they have more indebtedness capacity. And the Asian countries have overcome us because China is really has a very high debt. But we are moving towards a stabilization degree, including 2025. So I think that it is quite important. I'm going to leave this aside for now. This was about the external sector where Latin America, we would say, has had good situations when international prices went up and not when they go down. Now, poverty rate and extreme poverty. There are different measurements of every kind. But if we have a look at CEPAL, since 1990, where poverty, measured poverty by CEPAL, was at almost 50%, and the average of the World Bank in terms of minor poverty was there too. There has been an important reduction. The last figures are until 2023. In 2024, there are some countries where we could see more problems, but in general terms, there has been quite an important drop in the level of poverty. And there has also been a drop in the extreme poverty, the orange levels, okay? So in terms of what's the poverty here, we have Uruguay, Chile, Panama, Costa Rica, Paraguay, Dominican Republic, Peru, Ecuador. These are countries where the level of poverty is relatively low and the level of extreme poverty is relatively low too. But there are countries like Colombia where the situation is quite more serious. And the other thing is that Latin America here, well, I really don't want to take much time. Latin America has the worst income distribution. Here, the graph on the left with the red line is the Gini level that shows imbalance. The higher the worse. Net from income and transfers. If we measure imbalance before taxes and transfers, the US is almost at the same level as Latin America, but Latin America has seen a drop, a small drop since the beginning of the century because of the exchange rates, but it is still the most unequal region. Unfortunately, we are tied right now with Africa. We are at the same level as Africa, but that's not a reason to be proud of. Neither for them, not for us. In this, Western Europe, integrated without Russia, has had a better situation. And in this case, we have many graphs in terms of what are the Gini levels, the adjusted Gini levels by net distribution. In general terms, some countries have done a good job, like Uruguay, Argentina, in some aspects, Dominican Republic. And in general terms, there have been some distributions, but it's not quite a strong distribution because of the policies. So these are areas that are very difficult. So, without wanting to speak for much longer, this is a graph that I would encourage you to read as if we were comparing things correctly. If we compare the growth of the region or the countries of the region, if we compare them with the advanced countries, we can see the differences in growth during the military and democratic periods. And the democratic periods have been better than military periods, with the exception of Brazil and Ecuador. But there is a very long chapter about these things, and I highlight that the great structural problems that Latin America has are protectionism, because there are different kinds of protectionism. It seems that the US are following this irrational protectionism that we used to have in countries like Argentina, and we have corporativism too, between governments, trade unions, companies, that it's not helpful either. We have the way how the trade unions work. We have market concentration that is connected to protectionism, uh, corruption at public policies level, and of course, imbalance, inequality. So these elements have made it suffer quite a lot. Sorry for being too fast because there's a lot of information to convey. The interesting thing is that Latin America has a human capital index that is the important element of the growth besides the investment. And there we can see the FLA countries that are the ones that have been able to manage things better in terms of human capital index, with the exception of Paraguay. And this is measured as follows. I'd like to say that education indexes, in terms of how completing primary education without secondary education, gender equality education, etc., Latin America has done quite a good job. And in university, at university level, we've done quite a good job too, although there are not many people with a degree compared to other countries. There's an important topic here that are the PISA results, international results, in terms of education performance in primary and secondary. This is for countries with average to high income onwards. I mean, there are no countries with low income, but in total terms, Latin America is below the average. And we would say that it has not improved. There are some countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, and some cities in China, some places in Europe that have had quite high performances. In PISA, the last one was in 2022, and Latin America is not at the same values, but it is at a mediocre position, I would say. Although we have an important level of literacy. So I won't get into the growth. I've talked for a very long time, but there's a growth model in all this. There's a model that is based on the policies that have been followed up to now. And in that sense, Latin America, as happens with the rest of the world, is growing at a very low level. But the point is that if it improved its policies, it could grow much more. If Latin America maintains and keeps its policies, their per capita income could be 1.5%. And if the policies were 0.9%. But if there are policies that are more similar to Asians, macroeconomic policies, and in general better policies, we could have a very important growth, a very important increase. It is a region that can have the highest performance in improving its policies, and that's a big deal. I'm not going to speak about other topics that I've covered, protectionism or international integration, that is extremely important. Everything that has to do with how productivity is measured. Uh, I'm not going to speak about the relationship with China, where China is a great marketer with Latin America, with the exception of Mexico, but it doesn't lend as much as you could think. The Europeans and the US are the ones that are lending more, either in terms of direct investment or as loans. So China basically is a great business partner, but not necessarily the one that is helping the most. It was burned out a little bit. I can speak openly, and as happened with Japan, because during the 80s and 90s they invested a lot and they realized that there were problems. I won't get into that. Just the last slide is very simple. Here we can see a graph that is basically telling us what we need. And this is, well, all common sense. The graph says empire of law. We have to respect the rule of law. We have to respect the law. We need to have a good governance, macro stability. Of course, we need to have global cooperation. That's difficult to say in these times, but we have no other choice. Openness and competitiveness. So what's happening right now? We are closing on ourselves a little bit more, but I think that this is paramount. We need to open to the rest of the world, and I think that inclusion is necessary as an economic element, not only as a social element, and to improve human capital. So here we have a very thorough list. Well, not a very thorough list, but 6 bullet points. Every country should have its own plan. I couldn't say that this is the formula, but a very serious plan has to be followed. And plans don't have to do with ideologies. They have to do with the fact of what has worked, what hasn't worked. And in this case, we are speaking about ideological aspects. My experience from the IMF and out of the IMF is important in this case. And another thing would be that we need to have short-term convenience, for example, and we should get into serious work with some level of consensus. We know that policy and politics are difficult, and here, no, well, yeah, I think that I finished my presentation. Sorry for speaking for that long, but there was a lot of information to convey. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much, Claudio, for sharing the main takeaways of your book. It's a very useful interpretation of your book and the main aspects that are part of the structural challenges for our region that shouldn't be any further delayed. We've had low growth decades compared to other regions, and in some aspects we're doing good, but we are not as good as we should. So maybe it's a good time to think about an agenda with the long-term work that entails institutional work and political work. You were also speaking about the important progress in areas like inflation control, but this is not enough. And for example, that's the case of the tax aspects that have been quite a lot quite a lot impaired, and we have to pay attention to that. Great. So now let's listen to Alejandro and his remarks about what he has to say regarding Claudia's book. And of course, we're very grateful to Alejandro to the fact of accepting our invitation. I'm going to make a very brief introduction of Alejandro. Maybe I'll run short because he has a very long CV. He has been working both in public and private sectors and academic sector too. And he has been the manager of he's been part of the IMF. In Mexico, he held different public positions. He was the deputy secretary of the tax authority. He was the director of the Research Institute in Mexico. Now he's a founder of Georgetown Americans Institute and senior fellow of the Ella Peterson Institute by international economist. And Alejandro is a PhD in economy by the MIT. And he has been acknowledged as a youth global leader by the World Economic Forum. Thank you very much, Alejandro, again, and the floor is all yours. Thank you, Carlos. Thanks for the invitation. And the truth is that it's great to be with you all. Sorry. Speaking about Claudia's book, I think that it's a very good book. The one that you usually teach about Latin America are using that a lot, and it's a very useful tool. And I think that it has many insights about the problems that are affecting the region. Something that Claudio showed during his presentation was handling out by public finances, but in this case, for the sake of time, let's try to be brief so that we can have time for questions. I would complement Claudio's presentation, and I would highlight crime and insecurity, because Latin America is one of the regions, or the region that is the most insecure in the world. If I think of my country, if we speak about the rule of law, and there are authors that insist in informality, etc., there are 100,000 people that have disappeared in Mexico. There are 7 Mexican cities in the top 10 of the most violent cities in the world. So when a state can't guarantee the personal security, it is very difficult to think that it is a context that eventually can generate development and economic growth. So I think that many of the multilateral aspects have been focused on crime and its impact on the economy. I think that we have to think a little bit about it even further. But I think that competition is important too. When we go through Latin America, we really see the level of concentration on key markets. We see very high markups. We don't see much competition. And in that sense, that obviously entails lower levels of investment. It entails higher relative prices of some basic goods that have a direct impact to the lowest deciles of population. And of course, we have to energize the regulation policies as we are seeing right now. For example, in Argentina, that's quite a deal. That's quite an important topic. Something that is correlated to the development is the lack of effective governance at regional level. And I think that is in today's world where we are moving towards a much higher level of fragmentation, the fact that Latin America doesn't have a regional voice would affect us. It affects us in global discussions, etc. And we've been a region that is unable to leave our ideological differences aside and look for points of consensus in order to bring them to international forums so that we can push the region forward, no matter it is managed by left-wing or right-wing parties. And in other regions, we see much smarter governance at regional level, where they are looking for the common aspects, the common things that the region needs. And in a coordinated way, they are pushing forward and they are trying to get them at different forums with the advanced regions governments. And in the current situation, in the middle of a negotiation between China and the US, Latin America shouldn't have any extreme positions, and we shouldn't be aligned just with one or the other. I think that these points would complement the Claudia's presentation, and maybe regarding that short term. I think that tariffs and in 2025 we'll see these tariffs and uncertainty, and this uncertainty, no matter we will finish the year better or worse, as far as we have uncertainty, everybody is negatively affected. So in 2025, I think that uncertainty will affect, for example, the investments in the region. And it has not been surprising that the region behaved as part of the global phenomenon of dollar weakness. And in the end, we saw a strengthening of the different currencies. We were part of this process of dollar weakening. And I think that the region, in some aspects, Mexico wanted to be the protagonist since February. In some way, they said, hey, take a step forward, lead a charge, and together with Canada, maybe after China, you will be part of the protagonists of this work. So the process with Mexico was already here, with tariffs of 25% to every product that does not fulfill the free trade agreement, tariffs to vehicles, etc. And many things were connected to other factors that have to do with bilateral relation, like migration, organized crime, and drugs. But after that, Latin America was quite a secondary character of the Liberation Day. Almost every country in Latin America had the minimum rating, with 10% of tariff. There are some countries that consider that have a relative positioning that is not as bad compared to other competitors, and they will land in a situation where that damage is minimized. And there can be some trade deviation towards them. That could be some kind of favorable when creating that trade fund. Well, that could be negative, but in terms of magnitude, that could be relatively low. And thirdly, there's an opportunity because there's an important level of exports of raw materials in Latin America. There should be a premium. Basically, in terms of reliability of raw materials in bilateral relationships, not knowing that if you sign knowing that if you sign a contract to purchase raw materials for the next 5 years with Paraguay, for example, Paraguay won't use that contract in a geopolitical way. So maybe there are countries that prefer to pay 2% or 3% more by soy if they know that it comes from a country that they are not going to use that soy offer with a strategic intention. So we'll see that in the region, more interest commodities, copper, lithium, silver, and obviously everything that has to do with agriculture. And we have Mexico and Central America, and Mexico and Canada are amid this discussion with 25% rates to the products that are not qualified into the USMCA because of two reasons. Some of them are not fulfilling the rules of origin. So in that case, you would go to the most favorable nation rate to get into the US. And there are others that maybe are fulfilling the treaty conditions, but as the global rate by the US was very low, maybe there were companies that decided not even to develop that procedure to go through the USMCA and that rate, that tariff. So in the case of Mexico, the exports to the US get there paying a tariff. They do not use the benefits of the free trade treaty. And now that the tariffs are being increased, it's very expensive not to having fulfilled the rules of origin. So in 3 to 6 months, there would be an important part of all this that would fulfill the rules of origin, but they didn't want to follow the administration procedure, so do it. And if there are if there are some that are not fulfilling that, maybe they will try to change different inputs in order to fulfill that. We'll have the renegotiation of the free trade treaty between Canada, Mexico, and the US. It will be for 2026, so there will be an additional round. And I think that there will be an important aspect of free trade with Central America. There could be intentions to move towards bilateral treaties. This government sees an important value in the US in the bilateral negotiation compared to regional negotiation. And maybe we will see a move in that sense. And last but not least, I think that we will see, or the US government will have to decide about political trade offs. So, this movement in tariffs is trying to increase the tax collection and to reindustrialize the US to attract specific sectors, to make a block against China in order to keep on deep diving in the economic decoupling between the US and China. And many of these goals are not consistent with one another. So the US will have to see whether that economic decoupling from China is a priority goal. Maybe Central America, Mexico, and Canada will be complementary to the reindustrialization process in the US. So in this case, we will have a conflict, especially in the automotive sector and other sectors that are strategic for the US, and we will have a reaccommodation. Sorry, we've lost the sound, I'm afraid. The interpreter apologizes, but it seems that we have lost the connection. Yeah, we're back, and we'll see different results. But anyway, Latin America, going to Claudia's bullet points, the main challenges are these ones. Sorry, we've lost the sound again. The interpreter apologizes, but it seems that we are having some technical issues. We're working on it. Yeah, according to crime and insecurity, this is being experienced throughout the region, and you are also sharing the lack of competitiveness. The interpreter apologizes again, but we are constantly losing the connection.
The interpreter apologizes, but it seems that we're having some technical issues. So, in some cases, the long term could be important for the region too, right? I would like to open with that part to give some space for Claudio for reactions about remarks by Alejandro. And first and foremost, considering the main messages from your book, Claudio, and the current situation at commercial level, what are the main opportunities and challenges that are being faced by the region in order to revert this trend according to what you can see and according to what Alejandro has said? Okay, so first of all, I would like to say thank you to Alejandro for his presentation. So saying that it's complementary would be to minimize the aggregated value of what he has done. Absolutely. I totally agree with him. And obviously, Latin America, in this situation on the short term, besides the macroeconomic aspects, etc., has an advantage, I would say, in what we see as follows. In this trade war, if it continues, the U.S. As a raw materials exporter would lose advantage because there would be tariffs, and Latin America, in terms of agriculture, mining, a little bit less compared to the U.S., would have a very important benefit. The other thing would be that right now, the rest of the world, well, we see that the US is trying to look for an alliance against China. But I think that after this moment of uncertainty and what I would call the irrationality of protectionist policies, and I'll make a footnote in a few seconds, the rest of the world is trying to see how to cooperate with or without China. And I think that Latin America, in this sense, can win a lot. Regarding protection side, I have to say something. Many years ago, my PhD dissertation was about protection and the impact of of the so-called effective protection in Argentina as an example, and showing how it really affected the country and how the most affected ones were the consumers and industries. And this is why I have these anti-protectionist vision. So for Latin America to work, well, it has the human capital in different countries in different ways, but we need to have more cooperation. One of the big problems in Latin America is that, well, I really don't want to get either historic or hysteric, but from Bolivar, who wanted to do that great unification, we have not been able to cooperate in an effective way. When we've tried to integrate ourselves, it has been like, well, I'll sell to you, you'll sell to me, but we have not integrated our industries. I think that what I'm saying industries, I'm not speaking about manufacturing industries only. I'm speaking about everything that has to do with activities, especially in a moment where services are more important than goods in the gross domestic product of the country. There's a lot to be done. I think that Latin America is prepared. I think it's ready. Obviously, the problem in terms of criminality, well, I haven't mentioned that, by the way, and I think that it's quite a serious problem. And other things that have been mentioned by Alejandro, well, this is really affecting us. But I think that cooperation is important. So not in the FLA countries, Paraguay is, but We have that possible agreement between Mercosur and the European Union. I'm not saying that this is the best of the world, but we can work with the countries of the Pacific countries, with Asia. So we can work in many areas, and we can even cooperate with the US. So it's true that tariffs in Latin America have been relatively low, but there's work to be done, and we'll have to work with the US. And anyway, we would be speaking about 75 to 80% of the global GDP in the case of the US. So that's important. Great, Claudio. I have two additional questions. Uh, we are running out of time. So, first question for you, it has to do with part of the structural elements that you've mentioned, and it is why the industrialization and structural transformation process in our region were not solid enough to absorb migrant population in the rural areas, and it provoked persistent growth of the low productivity sector. This is one of the main elements in our region. And according to your analysis, what could we do in order to tackle this issue? Well, I really think that the problem is that the industrialization policies or the structural policies were not inclusive. I'm not being woke here, okay? I'm speaking about productivity. So the industrialization policies were directed to, well, were trying to benefit specific sectors, specific economic sectors, together with businessmen that were connected with the government, and they were protected maybe to produce in an efficient way with by an agreement with the trade unions. Not in every country the trade unions were that strong, but obviously we had these exclusivity process. And it's like, well, I'll do this, I'll do that, and it's like, well, I'm ruling, so I'll ask for a commission to do that favor. So although it doesn't sound very well, the corruption element has been quite important. So this left many people out. A different thing would be a progressive labor policy, but it made costs grow, not uh, not in the same everywhere, not the same in everywhere. Sorry, but it was a cost for the employer, like 50% over the cost they are paying. So SMEs are perfect for informality. So Argentina is a champion in that. The level of informality is very high. And we maybe you have to reduce costs and we have to manage profit differently. So Mexico worked very well on that. And I would say that important progress has been made. But countries like Uruguay that are in a very good situation, they really have serious trouble. But for the future, these changes are important. And we have to reinforce the necessary part regarding tax and monetary policies in order to improve the tax position. And there are important tax aspects besides retirement, etc. But I think that the most important thing would be to work transparently. And when I'm speaking about the people that are inside, um, we have to take different things into account. Education, for example, education is an important issue because Latin America spends a lot in education in relative terms, but it spends wrongly. And I think that we have to improve in order to create a more efficient labor force. And in terms of investment, the rules have to be more important. We need to have a lower level of legislation compared to what we have. We're champions because we have inherited the Napoleonic Code in terms of legislation. I could speak about this for hours, but I think that, well, this more or less covers my perception in order to answer your question. Thank you very much, Claudio. And there's another topic that you touched during the presentation. It has to do with productivity, specifically low productivity. It it explains part of the development in Latin America. So where would we have this low productivity in order to explain that low performance in the last decades? What factors are attributable to this low productivity, and what reforms would you propose in order to overcome this challenge? I understand that you've already talked about this sometimes. So protection and monopoly, that would be one that would be a very important one, in the sense that protection creates monopoly or duopolies. It's like I don't have to be that modern, so I don't invest in new things. I protect myself. And in many sectors, well, they're not open to international or internal competition. So that reduces things a lot. In terms of innovation entailed by the new investment, it's not the exporting in the exporting sectors. This is not the case. And education and relevant education is another element. So these are the important topics: legislation, openness, etc. I don't want to speak further about this, and I don't want to tire the audience by repeating things. Thank you very much, Claudia. Now I'm going with a couple of questions for Alejandro. First one: which ones are the main obstacles for the integration of Latin America with the global economy, and how could we overcome them? Maybe we could speak about the points that you raised, but well, you have the floor, Alejandro. You're on mute. Yeah. Well, I've obviously talked about the lack of regional effective governance, but I also think that the lack of regional leadership, of leaders that think of regional integration as a political important topic, well, this has failed. During the 90s, Mexico was focused on reinforcing the relationship with the U.S., and this is what the Mexican leaderships tried to do, and the Brazilian leaderships were focused on strengthening the regional leader position in South America through Mercosur, through political alliances with different governments with similar ideologies in South America, etc. So, to make the long story short, I think that if there's no movement from Brazil and Mexico in order to accomplish a higher integration, it's difficult to think that the region is going to integrate. So Claudio showed that in on its initial graphs, depending on the year, the exchange rate, etc. Brazil and Mexico represent 60% of the regional GDP. Mexico was and still is, because of different reasons, a country that believes in free trade, and Brazil is a country that believes in protection. It's felt as a continental economy that has an important negotiation power, and it has a relatively interesting size to protect itself. If we don't break this vision, and I think that the current situation could be a situation that says, well, maybe we have to strengthen the regional bonds. And in that sense, the movement towards economic integration comes through the reinforcement of regional integration, as far as we have the vision that the regional integration in this context of higher global integration difficulties, that could be beneficial. And we have to try to strengthen the alliances with the world blocs that really believe in globalization, the EU, etc. But these are slow blocks in negotiation. But I think that this is the time for Latin America to finish the free trade treaty between Mercosur and the European Union, so that uh, Mexico still has already has a treaty, but they are reviewing it with the EU, and it should be the relationship with China should be conceived from a strategic point of view, in order not to lose the relationship with the economy that is going to grow the most in the world in terms of the in global economy in the next 20 years, without jeopardizing our historic bond with the US. Thank you very much, Alejandro. And now let's move to macro and financial stability, according to your experience. So, how do you consider the tax policies of the Latin American countries in such a challenging environment on a global scale? And do you really consider that they are aligned with the long-term growth goals? Well, I would say that the tax policy in tax consolidation towards primary surpluses that stabilize the debt, as Claudia has said, has been quite slow, and the debts have grown. Latin America benefited from the inflationary bubble, and this is why the debt increase was not very high, and this won't happen again. So, in this sense, I think that the consolidation of the primary surpluses should have been much quicker, and it's not a good time. It will be worse if we don't do it. And regarding the monetary part, I would say that, well, you can find things in Mexico, Colombia, etc. And this is lack of support by the basically this has been a poor management. In the case of Colombia, has high interest rates, but for example, the central bank should reduce the interest rates, but it should be done in a context where there is trust and confidence in the public policies. I think that if the tax authority in Colombia announces a 2-year period, it would open the possibility for the central bank to reduce the interest rates. I think that Mexico, that is getting into recession, as far as we see that uh, tax consolidation, if it's in the good path, I think that the central bank could reduce the rates. But we've seen that in Chile and in Peru, etc. We've seen that the interest rates reduction cycle has been quite natural and ordered. So the framework of flexible interest rates with inflationary target, I think it has proven to be one of the big institutional changes of the region together with autonomy of central banks. Totally agree. Okay, so time's up. But I'll ask you one final question, just 1 minute for each. Okay? So, what should be the essential components of a renewed long term strategy, and how could the region balance the macroeconomic targets with the social equity and financial targets with social equity? Let's start by Claudio. Claudio, you go first. Well, obviously, the macro balance is empowerment is a necessary condition. Without that, we wouldn't have anything. And I think that it is important in tax terms to work in supporting the weakest sectors. We should have a reform in terms of expenses. So there's a very high, there are many expenses that go to things that shouldn't be there. They should go to education, but in the good sense of the word. And this has to go hand in hand with a smart integration process, as Alejandro has said. So this is what I see, to make the long story short. Thank you, Claudio. Alejandro, go ahead. Well, in 1 minute, something that Claudio mentioned, I think that we need to have a country program that is accepted uh, at an 80% by 80% of the political spectrum, and we should be reinventing the tax structure, the social policy, and in some cases the macroeconomic policy each time a different government takes over. And this will allow us to focus on the future. So this workshop, this is a criticism to my presentation, to Claudia's presentation, maybe to your questions, and it's a criticism to the region. We have focused on the past because in that case is where the region is stuck, pensions, taxes, etc. Maybe in Asia, we'll be speaking about big data, AI, the new labor market, how we're going to take advantage of all these things. And without that, Latin America, in relative terms, will lag behind the other emerging countries. Great. So we have to overcome the basic things, yeah, in order to move on. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Claudio and Alejandro. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. We have to wrap up. We are very grateful for your great contributions and conversations about this book, about this relevant book for the region. Without any kind of doubt, Latin America is facing the great challenge of changing its path after decades of economic performance, and we know that there's not just one solution, and we should reinvent things that have already been invented. So each country has the task of designing its own plan and implementing it. Thank you very much to our audience, and we'll see on the next edition. Thank you very much.